Hey everyone, it's been a while since I've had a video recorded in the forest, so let's go. The topic for today is around who is a Rails architect and how to become a Rails architect. And just a disclaimer at the beginning, obviously it's a very subjective definition, so it's just my attempt to define it. And the reason I'm trying to define it and help you maybe to become a Rails architect is because we are organizing Rails Architect Conference in Wrocław, Poland, 22nd, 24th November 2019, this year. Let's try to define it. My main definition of Rails architect is someone who can handle and work on a big Rails project. A big/large Rails project, where by large I mean the feature scope, the number of lines of code, the complexity of the business, maybe the accidental complexity. Someone who can deal with this, and not only at the level of drawing diagrams, but also at the level of design and code. So I put quite a lot under the umbrella of the word architect. Funnily enough, the term architect is not very popular in the Ruby community, in the Rails community, or almost doesn't exist. So the first question which comes to my mind is whether this is a universal word. So let's say it's a popular label in the Java community or in the .NET community that someone is an architect. So can we take this architect to a Rails project and assume and hope that they will help us and be efficient? Sure how popular it is for cats to live in the forest, but this white cat over there, I've started seeing him in this area of the forest like, I don't know, 3 years ago, and it's constantly in exactly this area. I really need to know why exactly here. So what happens when you take a Java architect and try to make him valuable for a Rails team, for a Rails project, is that they will know the overall design patterns, architectural styles and drivers, but if you put them in an existing Rails project, they most likely have no idea what are the typical Rails patterns and Rails architectures, and what is the Rails way, a very complicated approach to producing a software architecture which works well for small projects but doesn't work very well for biggest projects. My subjective opinion here. This requires quite a lot of additional skills. So my short answer is that if you take a Java architect or a .NET architect or a PHP architect and try to make them valuable for a Rails project, this will not work very easily. They will need quite a lot of time to get familiar with those Rails patterns, typical Rails libraries, where it's easy because the Rails world is unified and almost every Rails project looks very similar, but also it's very difficult because the Rails way is very difficult because it relies on magic, and you need to learn those magic tricks in order to know how to get out of them step by step. So Rails architect, I think, deserves its own term, and this is a very unique and specific set of skills. Assume a different situation, a reverse situation. Let's say you are a Ruby programmer, a Rails programmer with many years of experience, let's say 10 years of experience, and you are working on all those big Rails applications, being exposed to the Rails way in many different ways. You know all the problems with device, you know all the problems with Pondit, you know all the problems with active record being abused. So is it just some years of experience, a number of Rails patterns that will make you a Rails architect? This is where I would disagree. I believe you need to be exposed to more rich set of patterns that seem to be not really existing in the Rails community. So if you are just living in our Rails bubble, then it's rare to learn those design patterns and architectural styles which can help you dealing with bigger projects. What are those patterns and what does exactly mean to deal with large projects? Let me try to answer. So dealing with a large project, large race project, by that I mean that you are able to add new features, improve the architecture over time, but the important part is that it's a continuous process. So it's not like, let's take 6 months of refactoring and now our architecture will be better. But I mean by that you're dealing with the situation that it's a production project, it has some users, you have to deal with existing data scheme, you have to deal with the evolution of the data scheme. And you're getting out of the whatever is the current situation, which is usually the Rails way, to something better. And the solution to this kind of problems is everything that is around the continuous deployment, continuous delivery. And there is some research by Martin Fowler and his team behind ThoughtWorks, where the main solution seems to be the more successful projects which are dealing with large projects over time are those ones where the architecture is loosely coupled. And by loosely coupled, we mean the situation where requiring to change one place of the system, one module, doesn't require changes in the other systems or the other parts of the system, so you can even deploy it separately. But let me warn you that I don't mean microservices necessarily here. There are some other approaches which don't require microservices, and let's talk about them for a while. Let's just clarify what's with microservices. I don't think microservices, and they are understood in the Rails world as those things behind HTTP, which is not really the right definition, and overall service-oriented architecture doesn't have anything to do with HTTP. It just have a way to do of like how do you put things into modules. But let's even stick with the definition popular in the Rails community and also in other communities where it is about HTTP. So it is, when you mean by HTTP, you mostly mean the deployment infrastructure and the deployment architecture, which is important. And I think as an architect, it's good to be aware what are the challenges there, but it's not really crucial. You can be a great architect without really needing to know a lot about microservices, meaning the HTTP applications. The term which I'd like to use is modulith. So a modulith is a modular monolith. So if you listen to DHH, he's a fan of this majestic monolith, but he means by that mostly the idea that you have one server, which is okay. But modulith means you can have a monolith which is modular inside. But what are those magical modules? That's the problem. Everyone seems to be saying that you just need to put your code into modules and suddenly you have the right architecture, but that's the crucial part. How exactly you're going to create the modules? That's the problem. And this is where some buzzwords appear. Let's talk about two of them. One of them is CQRS. The second one will be domain-driven design. The reason I want to start with CQRS, as in command query responsibility segregation, you will not remember that, so don't even try. It's just a simple idea. The pattern is around splitting your commands from your queries at the system level, meaning that if you have a website, and in Rails you have websites, and you're showing the list of projects somewhere, and that list of projects is a query to the system at some point, and this can be one module. So we can call it a read module. That's what we call it in CQRS. It's one module. It's just responsible for persisting the state needed for showing the list of projects. So it's probably a data table and some way of populating this module with data. And that's one way of modularizing our software via splitting this into all those queries. So you're extracting the queries. And I'm mentioning CQRS at the beginning of this conversation because this is very useful pattern for typical Rails applications, because our Rails applications are mostly about viewing data, and we are using active record, which is perfect for implementing read models. And sometimes just by accepting the fact that we can extract read models first, we will have a much easier work to do in our Rails application. Very often this is a good first step to assume that 90% of our application is actually read models, and we can start extracting them, or we can start extracting the so-called command side or the write side. the part of the system where we apply changes to. The part where we want to apply the changes to, this is where domain-driven design comes into help, at least in my case, because it helps us structuring the domains. It helps us detect what are the different subdomains, where are the boundaries between them, and we need the third buzzword here, I'm sorry. The third buzzword is event-driven architecture. We need events to communicate, because otherwise, how can the read model know when to populate data with a new project? We know it because there is an event called project registered or project started, and then we know that we can list the project, so we can just call project.create in that read model, and that project.create is a active record which is only in the scope of this read model, so it's usually namespaced. And if you are using events, you have a decoupled read model, so whenever you change just the implementation of the read model, you have no chance of breaking other parts of the system. No chance of breaking other parts of the system. This is something new to Rails applications where everything relies on magic, or more precise, on meta programming. So on the way how class are named, or sometimes how methods are named, and just renaming something can break other parts of the system, right? So this is what is loosely coupled architecture, is that a change in one place doesn't require changes in other places, and we can in theory deploy them separately, which in the Rails world doesn't really mean anything because we are not a compiled language anyway. And an important note here overall, because I've seen CQRS applied also badly in some Rails projects, when you have a list of projects somewhere on your public website, and then you have an admin panel, and you're also displaying a list of projects in the admin panel, it's very likely, it's almost certain that those lists of projects are different. They are listed for different purposes. In the public view, you just want to expose it to the maybe unregistered users, while on the admin panel you show it with different data around. So for maybe you have some reporting bits which are, maybe you want to show some I don't know, tickets count as part of the admin panel, where on the user's view you don't need it. In such situations, I recommend to create two different read models. So we are going completely against what is almost the, I don't know how to call it, the main rule of the Rails world. So don't repeat yourself, mostly at the data level as well. So we are creating read models where, for example, the project ID, project name might live in many different read models. And it's okay, because we are using event-driven architecture. So whenever we have an event called project renamed, and we need to be disciplined that the renaming only happens via this piece of code where we publish this event, then all the read models react to this, and they can update themselves. So when you rename the project, they are renamed. It is renamed everywhere, maybe apart from the project history read model, where you want to persist the old name of the project, right? So this is where it's allowed to, this is where you can see that there are different contexts and different pieces of code react differently to certain situations, and events give us this decoupling. And by events, another misconception is that events require being asynchronous, meaning that it's not happening at the same time, which is a way of implementing this, but it's not necessary. And very often in Rails projects where the assumption is that it's part of the same transaction, it's not even recommended. Sometimes we should do it as part of one transaction, especially that probably renaming a project is not something that is critical, and it can take more than 50 milliseconds. It can take 200 milliseconds, and this is enough of a time to update all those read models that we need. But you can say, Andre, you just keep adding new buzzwords and we are lost. You know, where is the domain-driven design? Why CQRS? Why event-driven architecture? Why loosely coupled architecture? And you didn't even mention your favorite words like aggregate and process manager or saga and stuff like that. But I think you need to learn those concepts. You need to distinguish between them, not just put them in one bag and say those are all the complicated stuff. In fact, they are simplifying our architectures for bigger projects, meaning we have this modularity. But there are different priorities for learning. So for a typical Rails applications, I would say you can learn and you can benefit more from having CQRS. So the skill of extracting read models, which requires you from you an event-driven architecture. At least you need to have some part of event-driven architecture. So you need to have parts of your system where you're publishing events, and you need to be confident that those events are published in the right way. And publishing events means just having some kind of object like, I don't know, event store or event bus. You just have a method called publish, and other parts in the system which have access to this event store, they react to it. It's kind of like an observer pattern. So yes, you require events. I mean, it's helpful to have events to extract read models, but CQRS is more useful than domain-driven design in many existing Rails projects. And by existing, I mean they kind of work, right? So you just try to bring modularity, and the view is easier to change the views and extract some views than it is to change the way the logic is written. And CQRS and the concept of read models allows us to deal with the complexity of the reads. It's much easier. Those are the leaves in our system. You know, the last thing, which is usually other places in the system, don't depend on those views, so you can easily change them. And that this way you're introducing this loosely coupled architecture, because you can introduce changes to the views, nothing else breaks. DDD comes handy where you want to have some modularity in the places where you have the business logic. And by business logic, I mean probably those places which you deal with either by some complex validations, especially those validations which have if or unless statements, or the places in the system where there are some if statements, or maybe you went with some polymorphism, which is quite cool, or maybe you went with the single table inheritance, which is also a solution to some business complexity. Not the best implementation usually, but that's one way of implementing this. So this is where domain-driven design can help. Once we get rid of the concept of read models and views, because that was the first step, it's much easier to deal with the domain-driven design, which also relies on events. So events is the kind of entry point to many other places. That's why we often mention events, like we mention events so often. And domain-driven design at the main strategic level helps us cut the application into modules bounded by the contexts. That's why the name bounded context, because we want to express the business departments in our code. And it's always there, so we just need to extract it. So we need those modules according to departments, maybe accounting, invoicing, reporting, ordering, inventory, delivery. Those are the bounded contexts. So those are the areas, the modules, the namespaces in your application later on. And what do they consist of? It's up to you. We are using those tactical patterns from domain-driven design. So, for example, if I have a concept of a project in my system, I will have an aggregate to make decisions which changes on the project object are possible and which are not. So there are usually some state machines. Like if project is at a certain state, for example, the project has ended, it was confirmed, finished, whatever is the state name, you don't want to allow to add new issues to this project. For example, let's say it's a Jira. And this is the kind of constraint. This is the kind of business logic that you can hide behind an aggregate. And it's good to have just one rule per aggregate, not just aggregate for everything. You can have as many aggregates for as little things as you like, especially if they sound like it's some kind of a state machine. This is what are aggregates for. Sometimes you have a situation where it's your application that decides on whether to do something or not. It's not the user. And it happens when you have a business process where you're waiting for certain steps to be completed, some kind of wizards. Maybe you have a complex ordering process. In such situation, the process managers are the pattern which is helpful. Process managers are kind of the reverse situation of aggregate. While still being a state machine, they're not checking whether something is whether user input is possible or not. They're more like deciding, okay, we know this has happened in the system already. Now we can decide whether something else needs to be done. So the process managers issues a request for a change, a command. You see, that's it. It was a lot of things, but the core concept is that an event is decoupling the fact that something has happened from the fact where it has happened, who did that, how they did that, and thanks to that you can react to one event in many different places. And the same happening with command. As I said, command is kind of like a request for a change in the system, and it's decoupled from who will handle the command, where's the place which changes the command. So someone can just issue a command without thinking, okay, which object do I need to call, which is a good pattern overall and allows us for more decoupling. We just need to have access to the command bus, let's say, and just need a way of saying, okay, this is the command I want to create. I want the system to do this and this. Again, this has nothing to do with asynchronous attempts. This has nothing to do with the distributed computing. It's just a way of decoupling our system. Okay, lots of new words, buzzwords, techniques. So let's wrap up. I started the conversation with the problem of who is a Rails architect. I was trying to define it via whether it's a Rails experience or maybe an architect from a Java world can help us in the Rails project. I think we need both, because even if you know what is DDD, CQRS, and so on, you need to be familiar with all those typical hacks that appear in Rails projects in order to actually introduce those patterns. So this is where I think there's a difference between an astronaut architect who just tells you you should do a read model from the one who can actually implement it. And I think the architect should be able to implement it quickly, and the architect should be the leader. You can have many architects in your project, and they should be the leader of showing how it's done, how it's easy, so that we can confidently apply those changes in a system. And this requires both Rails knowledge and requires what I call now the modern architectural patterns. So DDD, CQRS. I didn't mention event sourcing here, because event sourcing is just a way of persisting stuff, which is useful when you already have events in your system, but it's definitely optional and not required, and does introduce some additional complexity, event versioning, and so on. So while useful, I would wait with that till the end, which kind of summarizes the whole video. I hope it sheds some light for you to understand my concept of Rails architect. And the reason I'm contemplating those problems and trying to structure my way of defining this is because we are organizing this Rails Architect conference, which is quite a bold move on our side to try to create a conference for senior Ruby, senior Rails programmers, and gather some speakers from Arkansas and also outside of Arkansas. We are running a workshop, so a practical knowledge, 2 days of practical knowledge about exactly what I just said, with example code base where you can refactor and you can play with that with our help along the way through the first 2 days, which are the workshop days. And then there is the third day, which is the talks, which will give you an additional perspective on those things. And also for the participants of the conference and the workshops, we give the optional package of our Rails Architect Masterclass, probably the main part of this whole package, which is 13 modules, 13 weeks of materials, videos, code examples of quite a nice path, how to understand all the concepts which are required in our definition to become a Rails architect. So this is a whole package, practical exercises using the workshops in Wrocław, practical discussions using experts from our area. So listen to the talks, attend the conversations, discussions, meet the people, and then be part of the Rails Architect Masterclass, which is not only the videos recorded to be watched, not only the exercises and homeworks, which they are checked mostly by me, but also you're becoming part of the Rails Architect community, which we have created on our Slack channel, where you can browse through the archives, see what questions were asked, because those questions, they keep appearing and appearing, and this way we can help you while you are the member of our community. We can help you introduce those changes, kind of crazy area, in your real application. I think that's it. Let me know in the comments which parts are not clear. I will be happy to explain them. We are promoting our Rails Architect conference this year. It's happening in 6 weeks from today. If you're watching this in October, this is happening in 22nd, 24th November in Wrocław. I will let you know the right prices. They might be already at the landing page. It's there will be different prices for different packages depending on whether you want to attend the conference, the workshop. The number of places is limited, so for the workshop we probably have only 20 slots available, which is not much, and we already have some people which booked some of the slots. So if you or your company is interested in especially in the workshops part, then please tell me as soon as possible so that I can book some of the places for you. At least I can know that your company is considering this. We are limited by the venue. It might be that if there is bigger interest, clearly bigger than 20 people, there is a chance that we can book a bigger venue for the workshops part and bring more of our people to help you along the way, to mentor you through the workshops, but we need to know upfront. So that would be very helpful if you can just let me know, just contact me via Twitter or whatever, email us at dev@arkansas.com. That should be enough. Thanks for watching. Hope you like those forest videos. I do enjoy them, and see you next time. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are trying to bring more content there, bring more answers to your questions there. The more people see that, the more motivation we have for doing this. So again, thank you, see you, bye.